Juveniles locked up for life without parole. In 2012, the US Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences are unconstitutional. But some states are still handing down this punishment to people under the age of 18. I'm Femi Okay.
I'm Malika Bilal. In this episode of The Stream, we look at the growing number of states working to enforce this ruling and the impact it's having.
This man and this teenage boy were knifed and shot to death by children 16 or younger, who cannot be tried for their crimes.
Prosecutors blame rehabilitation programs for losing control of young offenders.
Did the juvenile system rehabilitate your son?
No, it did not.
There are no violent offenses that are juvenile. You rape somebody, you're an adult. You shoot somebody, you're an adult.
More and more states are prosecuting children as adults.
Under the new law, 15-year-olds can be tried as adults.
If you commit an adult crime, you do adult time.
15-year-old, 18-year-old.
He was 12 at the time.
The first 11-year-old ever to face life in prison without parole.
Well, you want to see rehabilitation, go to a museum.
That was a clip from the documentary They Call Us Monsters. It tells the story of 4 teens facing life in prison for murder or attempted murder. It also features some of the victims. We're joined by the director and producer of the film, Ben Lear, who's coming to us from Los Angeles, California. Ben, in that clip that we showed, first of all, people in that clip were pretty confident that young people who had committed a crime, they're monsters. You went into the film expecting to find what?
So I came to this project 4 years ago, having never stepped foot inside of any type of lockdown facility. I never met anyone accused of a serious crime. I was carrying with me a lifetime's, I think, worth of expectations about who those people were. And instead, in walks this room full of young people, teenagers who were giddy and excited. And I learned later, just after thinking about it a lot, we're in the middle of experiencing self-discovery, coming of age. And yet I also knew that they were all facing decades to hundreds of years in some cases in prison, and they were being tried as adults. Trying to reconcile those two seeming impossibilities, that on one hand, somebody can be so young and so seem to have so much potential in life, but also have done potentially, one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. And the fact that our legislators now in the United States, for the first time in 25-something years, that clip gives you a little bit of a historical context. We've been in a really serious tough-on-crime wave for decades now.
Yeah, Ben, we're going to debate this a little bit more in the program, because we've got other guests that we want to bring into the mix.
Sure.
Malika.
Sure.
But I did want to share this, though. This is a comment we got from Stephen Babcock. He's the father of Trisha Lynn Babcock, who was shot to death by a 12-year-old in 2009. And this is what he wants us to remember. He says the victim and victims and the families of those victims should always be at the forefront and always be taken into consideration first and foremost, always. They are the forgotten ones. They are the ones who can no longer speak for themselves. Ben, you talked about reconciling 2 different aspects. Here's just another one. What was it like weaving that into this documentary?
So for me, from the very beginning, including the victim's point of view, was absolutely essential. I would not have made the film if the victim side of one of these cases wasn't able to participate. And that's because I completely agree. That voice, it's in the case of a murder, it's quite literally silenced from the conversation. And I've seen that happen all too often in my experience on these issues in the last few years. So I couldn't agree more.
All right, you're going to hear more from Ben and from our other guests in just a moment.
Youth are different from adults. Neuroscience tells us that young people lack impulse control, judgment, and the ability to assess risks and consequences.
I rise in opposition. These are evil, menacing people. Mini Charlie Mansons. This is absolutely outrageous that we're going to release these little psychopaths back into the streets to yet murder again. I urge a no vote.
people who are called psychopaths as minors change as adults? The US Supreme Court thinks there is a chance they could. It ruled in 2012 that sentencing juveniles to life without possibility of parole is cruel and unusual punishment. Informed by the studies of the adolescent brain, the court concluded the mind of a young person is different from that of an adult.
Studies found juveniles can lack impulse control and be more susceptible to negative influences because their brains are still developing. And that development continues from the teen years into the mid-20s.
Today, more states are moving to draft legislation to comply with the Supreme Court's ruling. But victims' advocates say the victims and families have been left out of the process, dismissing their needs and concerns. To help us talk about all of this, in Chicago, Jennifer Bishop Jenkins is a victims' advocate. Jennifer's sister, brother-in-law and their unborn child were murdered by a 16-year-old in 1990. She co-founded the National Organization of Victims of Juvenile Murderers. Arturo Gonzalez is a member of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition in Glendale, California. At the age of 16, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole for second-degree murder. He was one of the first people released under a 2014 California law that gives people sentenced to life without parole as juveniles the opportunity for release. He served 21 years. And right here on our set, we have Jodi Kent-Lavie. She is the Executive Director at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth here in Washington, D.C. Welcome, everybody. Jennifer, let me show our audience a picture of a very happy time. This is your sister's wedding, this is your sister, your brother-in-law. This is you right here on the corner. I'm just thinking about your family tragedy and then how you think of this idea that somebody who is deemed to be a minor should have a second chance later on, even if they murder a number of people, as in your situation. Do you think that's possible?
I think that the framing this discussion around the concept of second chances is not really accurate. First of all, I just want to correct one little mistake. At the beginning of the show, I think we may have gotten the impression that there are some states still giving out life without parole sentences, and in fact, that's not the case. It's illegal in the United States. Now, there are some states that have not yet decided exactly how they're going to implement the Supreme Court mandate, but there are no more life without parole sentences for any juvenile offender in the United States, either going forward or retroactively. They've been made illegal. And so now we're just debating in this country how we're going to give them opportunities to argue for their own release or for a reduction in their sentence. And that's really the part that our organization is the most concerned about. We're concerned about victims' families who've been destroyed, their lives have been ruined, having to go through significant re-traumatization by going back to parole hearings frequently throughout their lifetime. And one of the things we've been hoping is that the advocates for sentencing reform for juveniles will work to keep victim revisiting of the case as minimal as possible, meaning that they should get at least one opportunity, according to the Supreme Court's ruling, to demonstrate that youth affected their wrongdoing. Right. But what we're trying to do is make it so that victims' families don't have to go back to court more than once. And that's really important because the trauma of having a loved one murdered stays with you all your life. We're talking about people's lives being destroyed on an ongoing basis.
Let me just bring in Jodi here. Jodi, what the Supreme Court decided with juvenile offenders, will there still be places in the United States where juvenile offenders will be given a sentence where they are not allowed parole?
Yes,
let's just clear that up.
Yeah, I wish, Jennifer, that you were correct there because unfortunately, with the Miller and Montgomery decisions, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down life without parole sentences for the vast majority of children, but unfortunately it is still on the books in a number of states, and it is still being imposed.
And
but
that's
what we
because
have
they haven't
seen over the
decided how to
last
comply with the Supreme Court.
in the last couple of years is an incredible groundswell of support for reform. The number of states that ban life without parole sentences for children has nearly quadrupled in 5 years following these Supreme Court decisions, because I think people recognize that children are not simply little adults. We can't treat them as if they are, and there's growing bodies of research to demonstrate that. And when we look at how these sentences have been imposed, it has been historically imposed on young people of color. African American children receive life without parole sentence at a per capita rate that is 10 times that of white children. So, I think we need to really be mindful of just
Judy,
how...
are you saying that those African American juveniles, those young offenders, didn't murder, didn't rape?
No, absolutely not.
Right.
Children can and do commit serious crimes. We need to be clear about that. The question that we're asked to answer as a society is how we hold these young people accountable, given what we know about their unique characteristics as children. And we alone in the United States impose these final, irrevocable judgments on our children. And the problem with that really is that it doesn't reflect what we know about their unique capacity for change and the fact that at the time of their crimes, they are uniquely susceptible to peer pressure. They don't have the same ability as adults to navigate the legal system. They don't have the same ability to escape harmful home environments. Jennifer brought up trauma. I think that's an important part of this conversation because I do see what we have seen with young people who have been given these sentences is that the vast majority of them, unfortunately, were exposed to trauma as children, were exposed to violence, and that was never treated. And as they say, hurt people hurt people. So we really need to look at how it is that we're addressing that trauma before these kids even come in contact with the system at all.
So Jody, there is someone here that agrees with you. This is Kathleen White on Twitter. She says, adolescent brain development means kids change and are more likely to be rehabilitated. All juveniles must be given a second chance. Not everyone is convinced, though. And Art, I'm going to pose this one to you. This is Gopi, who says, minors should be given no special treatment when the crime committed is more egregious in nature. A criminal mind transcends all age limits. Art, what do you make of that?
I would have to disagree with that statement. I don't feel that a criminal mind transcends age limits. In fact, I would have to agree with the sentiment that we just heard earlier. I came from an environment that was very traumatic. I witnessed a lot of violence and was exposed to a lot of things as a young man. And that affected my ability to make decisions. So when I was faced with trauma outside of the home, I would cope using what I had learned, what I was shown at home. And all that did was it started to snowball into an effect where
do you mind sharing some examples? Because I think the key to understanding the complexity of this conversation is hearing what was your experiences, what led you to getting a sentence as a minor?
I was raised in an environment where I witnessed a lot of domestic violence, drug use. I grew up in a neighborhood that was filled with drug dealers, gang members, people who promoted the criminal lifestyle, actually looked up to it and saw it as an asset. And these are the individuals who taught me how to cope. I didn't really have anybody like a mentor or a group like the Anti-Recidivism Coalition who could actually take me outside of that environment and show me a different way. So I ended up using these coping mechanisms myself. So I would solve my problems violently myself. If I disagreed with you on something, I would just fight you over it. If I won the fight, I won the argument. And if that worked for me, I did it over and over and over again until it became habitual.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I have to interject here that although we know there are many heartbreaking stories of abuse that has led to criminal behavior in young people, the fact is we're only talking about 1,300 or so cases across the United States, and all of those offenders are not in that situation. The man that killed my family members was 4 weeks shy of his adult criminal age birthday in Illinois. He was wealthy, family, white, good grades. He had every advantage. He never acted impulsively. He pre-planned, cold calculated for weeks in advance the murders of my sister, her husband, and their baby. Actually, he didn't plan it at them. He just planned a murder. He didn't pick his target until the very end. But he also didn't act impulsively. He didn't act under peer pressure. He didn't come from a traumatic upbringing. And he is one of those few people that we are trying to point out here. There are actually some people who are dangerous at a very early age and remain that way because fundamentally there may be something wrong with them.
Jennifer, first of all, I'm so happy that you're here. I appreciate you being here and sharing your story. I feel that it's absolutely true that there are young people who commit irredeemable acts of violence and will never change. And there are people of any age that should probably never walk the streets again because they will always pose a risk to society. So I agree 100%.
Yeah, I agree.
My focus is, and the reason why I think young people are different is simply because if you meet a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old, even an 18-year-old, to be totally honest, who commits a really serious crime, and not only commits a serious crime, but does it in a premeditated way, and then after the fact shows absolutely no remorse and displays every sign of being a psychopath, I still don't think you can say definitively that you know who that 18-year-old, 17-year-old, 16-year-old is going to be 10 years later.
Well, and that's what the science supports. Right,
for me, except that you have to balance the opportunities for release that you're giving them. If somebody hasn't shown remorse, as in my sister's killer's case, or if somebody was a serial killer in the making, as was my sister's killer, tried to kill his own parents before he killed them, then he tried to kill.
We can look at what reforms are happening around the country, right? As you know, the campaign has been deeply engaged in working around the country to end the practice of sentencing children to life without parole and replace those sentences with alternatives that bring about balance both public safety, ensuring that these young people are held accountable for harm that they've caused, and that give them an opportunity.
I want to pause you there because I want actually an example of what those alternatives are. Before you give it, I want to share what Linda says about that. This is Linda White. She's the mother of Kathy O'Daniel, who was killed by a 15-year-old, and this is what she thinks of those alternatives. Have a listen.
Even though my daughter Kathy was murdered by a couple of juveniles a number of years ago, and why I can support ending life without parole for juveniles is that my husband and I were simply crushed by what happened to us. We were not angry. We never had the energy for that much anger. So I have simply looked for and found nonviolent responses, and the nonviolent response that has meant the most to me has been restorative justice. I do believe they deserve a second chance. I don't believe they need to get out until they're ready.
She mentioned restorative justice. Is that one of the alternatives? And what does that mean?
Well, what we've seen actually around the country in states that are ending life without parole, they're replacing those sentences with other lengthy sentences, right? So it is not a slap on the wrist by any means. And none of these new reforms are actually going to guarantee anyone's release. And so for those very rare cases like the one of Nancy's killing Jennifer's sister, those are, oftentimes that's what these laws are set up to ensure that none of us want violent people in the streets. These sentences instead are making people parole eligible, just like Charles Manson has come up for parole 12 times. These reforms will make sure that that these children do. But I do want to provide some international context here because I think that that's important for our audience. The reforms that we're making around the country are replacing life without parole with other sentences. Many of them are decades long, right? For children as young as 13 and 14 years old. And just as context, in the Western world, in Western Europe in particular, the maximum sentence imposed on adults is 15 years. So we're still saying here in the United States that these children are going to serve double what grown-ups, in Western Europe are going to serve. And I think it's important to understand the history here. We saw some of that in Ben's tremendous film, just about the super predator theory, which was a racially charged theory that came about in the 1990s and led to these tough on crime policies that made it easier to try kids as adults at younger and younger ages. And at the same time, we saw truth in sentencing and an increase in mandatory minimums across the country. The confluence of these laws led to these extreme sentences imposed on children. While the super predator theory, which said that there were going to be these godless, fatherless monsters wreaking havoc in our communities, they displayed pictures of black children all over the media and called them super predators. That theory was disproven later. And the authors of that theory, those criminologists, have since come out and said, actually, what we know about children is that what works with them is rehabilitation, because we know they are uniquely capable of change.
Jody and Jennifer, let me just bring... I wanted to bring back Art. Jennifer, just give me a moment, because I want to hear from Art. Art, go ahead, please.
I definitely want to add to that. It's very true. I don't want it to appear as if the parole board, who is the gatekeeper, so to speak, in releasing juveniles tried as adults, you have to go to the board. In order for them to release you, you have to go through a tremendous amount of rehabilitation and reform programs. I had to do countless programs. I had to gain insight. I had to learn what remorse was. I had to demonstrate through my behavior that I had fundamentally changed in order to gain access to parole from the parole board. It was a very strenuous hearing. It was not easy by any means. These are not people who are just opening the gate and just letting people flood out. At the same time, I would say that without these programs, without NA, without AA, without victims awareness groups, without impulse control groups, what you are doing is you are not considering victims' families. It is a disregard to victims' families to not have these programs, because what happens is you end up stuck in prison, a juvenile tried as an adult, many of whom do not have life, but are actually have parole dates and will be coming home. And it creates a culture where they don't feel like they're a part of society. So they come home feeling that way, and they're going to behave that way. I had to go through the programs I had to go through, and at some point it started to connect. I would say around my mid-20s. So by the time I went to my hearing in 2014, it was an SB 260 hearing, which required board commissioners to take into account the fact that I was a juvenile at the time of my crime. It was a youth offender parole hearing, I'll give you that. But at the same time, I had to do the hard work. And I live my life in a way that honors my victim.
These parole hearings are very hard on victims' families. And when we are talking about not the kind of cases that you guys are talking about, when we're talking about the kind of cases, as in my sister's offender, and other of the really, truly dangerous, worst of the worst offenders, there are some of those. And it's really a misimpression to say that they're 13, 14. 90%, almost 90% of these juvenile lifers in America are 16 and 17 years old. That's the vast majority
of them. Were first-time offenders, and 25% of them weren't even the shooters. So let's set the facts out straight.
Most of them have killed multiple people.
No.
And everyone that knows me knows
Jennifer,
that I have
let me just ask this. I've just been listening to everybody, but surely in that circumstance, and Art has said this, and Jody has said this, and Ben has also said the same thing, is that there are situations where young offenders should not be released. Art says he had to do the hard work.
Right.
Are you not all saying exactly the same thing?
But, no,
You're not saying that everybody should be released.
So how do we build that into policy that the victims' families of those cases where they don't deserve release, don't have to go back and re-engage with them in a re-traumatizing manner? There has to be a way for those kinds of cases.
The challenge there, though, is there's no way to know whether or not somebody is deserving of release based on rehabilitation and changing their lives. If that's what these resentencing laws are about, which is what they're about. There's no way to know that unless you're giving them that opportunity.
If an offender has shown no remorse.
But how do you know if they've shown no remorse if you're not meeting them at the parole board?
The man that killed my sister denied
this conversation
that he
isn't
did it
over,
for
but I'm
25
going to put a pause on it for now because we have to go online to stream.aljazeera.com. We will continue online with our guests, with Ben and Jennifer, Art and Jody. And also, if you're interested in Ben's film, have a look right now. They Call Us Monsters, available now on iTunes and on demand. Thank you, guests. See you online. Hello, welcome back to our online post show. We were talking about sentencing juveniles to life without parole in the United States. I'm going to get right back to that conversation via Malika.
So this is a suggestion from Kathleen, who I read a tweet from earlier in the show on how to move this conversation forward. What has to happen? She says opportunities for communication between victims and offenders to begin a healing process and a greater understanding is just a start. Of course, that is easier said than done, but we got a video comment from someone who is doing just that. This is a former offender. This is Xavier Mikkel Rath Bay out of Chicago, and he was convicted of murder at 13 and released after 13 years of his 25-year sentence. Here's what he told us.
I was fortunate to be able to meet the sister of Pedro Martinez, the victim of my case. Weeks later, I met his family. I learned of the pain and hurt and suffering I had caused them. I see something healing in giving that individual an opportunity to come out and make amends and to live a life that doesn't defy justice, but that in fact goes beyond that, and being able to provide opportunities and being able to provide mentorship, being able to provide guidance and help for kids who could have made or could make the very same decisions.
Jennifer, I'm curious your thoughts on that, because I know that you met with the offender in your case and forgave him in public.
Right. I actually haven't met him. I've talked with him on the phone, and I have exchanged letters. I'm a strong supporter of restorative justice, and I spent the early part of my victim activism working against the juvenile death penalty. I'm a constant worker in restorative justice and sentencing reform and for victims' rights. And our point all along has always been that we can do sentencing reform in a way that doesn't drag victims' families through any worse trauma than what they've already been put through. And so when I first became aware of the effort to end life sentences for juveniles, I reached out to Jody and to others like her to try to establish that dialogue and see if we could do this reform in a way that would be minimally impactful on victims' families. And in fact, strategically, sadly, they decided that victims would always be oppositional, or they assumed that. And they decided not to include us, not to give us information about the cases, not to let us know where they were filing legislation or what cases they were filing court challenges on, not offering any resources.
That's just not true,
much
Jennifer,
as we asked.
and I'm sorry that you are being disingenuous
It
to
is
our
true,
worldwide
Jody.
audience here. Because we at the campaign have worked with some of the most courageous survivor family members around the country, including your sister
the ones that
Jean
agree with you,
and
not
others
the ones that don't
who disagree with us as well. And I've learned a great deal from speaking to mothers of young people who've been killed by young people in Philadelphia, for example. I think we need to be honest in this conversation that the disproportionate amount of violence and people impacted are communities of color, and that's where we focused our efforts.
Absolutely.
We've
No
focused
question
on
about
cities
that,
like
and
Detroit and Philadelphia and New Orleans, and we've reached out to communities to lift up the voices of people, because
And
we
you
know
know
there
I'm
is
doing that
not
work in
one
Chicago.
monolithic
I'm helping the young people in
perspective from
Chicago.
victims.
So, ladies, let me just pause for a moment. Ben, I'm curious, is it because we're talking about extremely violent offences that it makes it very difficult to come to an agreement between victims' families and the perpetrator? Not, in any other circumstances, if you're talking about young people who had committed crimes, I feel like there probably would be a lot more empathy. But when you're talking about people who first-degree murder, second-degree murder, that's tougher, isn't it, to get your head around? Did you find that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's partially the reason that I was so drawn to this was because there were no easy answers at all. Like I was saying at the beginning, it's to me it's irreconcilable. I don't know how you put those things together. I would never want to speak. I would never want to speak for Jennifer or any survivor of a violent crime, but I would imagine that the scope of reactions, of emotional responses and emotional journeys in the wake of something like having a loved one taken away would vary widely not only between people, but over time. And I think those that have gone to, in my experience of meeting survivors of crime, is those who have moved past the phase or are so hurt and so broken that they have no choice but to push beyond anger and an idea of a vengeance. What's on the other side of that? The only person who's still around in the wake of this violent crime is the perpetrator of that crime. And if there is the slightest potential of a chance that person can change his or her life, that there could be healing in some sort of a dialogue and some sort of a coming together, which I think that our system currently does an awful job of facilitating.
I would agree with that, Ben,
that
and
could be
I
a beautiful
actually
thing.
would support that. I do support that, and I have been working hard for that. But here's a question for all of the people like Jody that are working to change retroactively these sentences that were handed down, in some cases decades ago, to victims' families who are just now finding out that their lives are going to be upended. What resources could this movement that supports juvenile sentencing reform offer to those victims' families so that they won't be shocked, surprised, so that they have all the information ahead of time, as far as ahead of time. And every victim's family, not just the victims' families that agree with you, Jody, but all of the victims' families.
No, I think it's a terrific
be given
question.
every bit of information and every bit of resources
what we have done
that's available
at the campaign, to your point, is to work with the Department of Justice and state victim advocates around the country to get them information about what the laws have done with respect to the U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And what we've been promoting is the need for supportive services. Listen, my heart goes out to those. I cannot fathom what that loss is like. And what we want to know is that everybody impacted, both by these crimes and by the harsh sentences imposed, are getting the support that they need throughout the procose. And so we're advocating for that. But I think we'd be doing a disservice to this conversation if we didn't also
Jennifer and Jody,
on...
this is a global conversation. Excuse me for interrupting, because I understand and I am aware that you two have tension between you, that victims, families, advocates, and also advocating for juvenile offenders.
But I don't think that's quite fair.
There's a frisson there, and I understand that.
But there are plenty of victims who support these reform efforts, and a recent study by the Alliance for Safety and Justice says that the vast majority of victims of violent crime support rehabilitation over excessive penalties. So I think it's an unfair dichotomy to say that
I hear that, but I know in particular you two have a debate to be had. I want to move it, though, slightly as we wrap up this conversation to Art. Art, please, what were you going to say?
I want to say, I really want this to be said. I am not on the opposite end of victims' rights or victims' advocates. That came with my own personal change. I want the same thing that they want. As an ex-offender, as someone who was released as a juvenile lifer, I want an end to victimization. I want an end to criminalization. I'm one of the biggest anti-gang proponents you're ever going to meet. Victims awareness was one of the most impactful courses that I ever took while I was incarcerated. It really allowed me to develop the empathy that I carry with me today. I very much want to say that I often feel like sometimes the conversation takes us to a point where we feel like we're on opposite sides of the fence, when really we want the same thing. The national conversation should be, how do we bridge that gap? And
exactly.
That's perhaps a different conversation. But
I would love to work with you and anybody else on that, because that is the point here. I think you said it beautifully.
Right.
That we want to find a way to reform these sentences in a way that brings all of the victims' families
Jennifer,
as much
you made that
support as they
point
need to get
very
through that.
clearly through this conversation. I really thank you for being part of our debate today, and Ben Lear, Art Gonzalez, and also Jody Kent-Lavie. Malika, where do you want to leave us?
I'll leave us with a video comment from someone who I've heard it throughout this conversation several times, that there aren't two sides, though I think for Rebecca Petty there was one side, and she changed her mind, had a change of heart. This is Rebecca. She's an Arkansas state representative, and here's what she told us.
As a state legislator, you meet people and you learn to really listen to people. You learn to reach into their hearts and you hear what they say. And that's what happened to me when a bill that I opposed last legislative session, I'm in my second term, as opposed to this legislative session, I sat down, I met with Xavier, and his story touched me. It touched me as a human being, it touched me as a person. I realized that other children deserved that chance. So I sponsored the legislation for the campaign for the fair sentencing of youth in the state of Arkansas.
And Jody, the Xavier she referenced, we heard from a little bit earlier, former offender campaign for the fair sentencing of youth. You had a final thought.
Yeah, I think it would be a disservice not to acknowledge just how resilient and tremendous Xavier and Art and the many, many others are who were victimized as children, who committed serious crimes, are deeply remorseful, and have served decades in prison, and are now out and serving their communities in incredibly productive ways. And I do think it's also important to recognize that while it's not well represented here, the vast majority of the people impacted by the issues we're discussing today are communities of color, and we need to be mindful about the leadership roles they play in going about these reforms. So I'm incredibly grateful to Xavier and to Art, both who have done extraordinary work in that regard.
Thank you, guests. Let me leave you with one more image here on my laptop. They Call Us Monsters. It's Ben Lear's film, his documentary. It's available now on iTunes On Demand. And if you're in the United States, you can also see it on PBS on May the 22nd. Thank you, guests, for being part of this conversation. Appreciate your time. Take care.